This is the Thursday, March 25th, 2010 meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals. Will you call the roll, please?
Joanna Croft, Holly Sozo, Timothy Bigg,
Here.
Dean Cars,
Here.
Kenneth Burkhart,
Here.
Jeff Ron,
Here.
Joshua Fink, Ann Denny. Here.
That moves us on to our, on the agenda to the minutes. I don't believe we had any minutes for review. We do have a postponement? Okay. We have, I don't know for any of you that have seen the agenda, once we get into our public hearings, we have 4 cases on our agenda for this evening. One case, the petitioner has requested a postponement. That case is case number 2010-032. The applicant is the Alaska Club, LLC. That case has been, and that is our agenda item H04. That case has been postponed till the April 8th hearing. So if anyone is here to testify or hear that that case, 2010-032, the Alaska Club as the applicant, that will be postponed till the 8th of April. That moves us on to disclosures. Do we have any agenda item C1 disclosures? Do we have any disclosures from any of the board members this evening? Seeing and hearing none, we'll move on. Election of officers, C2. That's on the agenda. I would entertain a motion to move that to the end of the agenda. If that, Mr. Burkhart?
I so move.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there a second? Mr. Riggs, seconded?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any opposition by any of the board? I'm sorry. Moved and seconded. Any discussion and or opposition? If not, we'll move that to the end of the agenda. That moves us on to the consent agenda. We have 4 resolutions for approval on the consent agenda. Those are Resolution 2010-001, Resolution 2010-002, Resolution 2010-003, Resolution 2010-004, and Resolution 2010-006. 5 resolutions. Does anyone would anyone like to pull any of those from the consent agenda prior to approval? Could I have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Thank you, Mr. Ron. Can I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Thank you. Is there any discussion on the approval of the consent agenda items? Seeing none, that motion's approved. We have no appearance requests, unfinished business, or regular agenda items. So that moves us to our public hearings. We have 3 cases before us this evening. And before I get to the first case, I'd like to read the order of business for variances. The chair will introduce the case. The board will hear and rule on any objections to the sufficiency of notice. The board will hear a brief staff presentation outlining the case, not to exceed 10 minutes. The board may then question the staff. The applicant will give his or her presentation, not to exceed 10 minutes. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof rests on the applicant to convince the board by a preponderance of evidence that the variance should be granted. After the applicant's presentation, the board and the staff may then question the applicant. The staff will have an opportunity to rebut the applicant's presentation, not to exceed 3 minutes. The board and the applicant may then question the staff. The applicant will then have an identical opportunity for rebuttal. The hearing will then be open for public testimony. Each person has 3 minutes. After the public hearing, the staff, followed by the applicant, have the right of rebuttal. Then the matter rests with the board, and the chair asks for a positive motion from the board. Just a point of information as well. You see we have 6 board members in attendance this evening. That a fully constituted board is a 9-member board. The requirement is for a majority, in order to grant a variance, a majority of the fully constituted board. So in this case, 5 members need to vote. I need to do the math. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, there's 6 of us here tonight. So vote of at least 5 are necessary for the applicant for a variance to be granted. We do not have a 5-member board, which is considered a short board. In that instance, the case can be postponed at the board's discretion. However, if any applicants wish to, they would be required to post a rescheduling fee. Mr. Baird, that's correct, right? So,
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. With that in mind, that brings us to our first case. Case 2010-003, the petitioner, Barbara Donatelli. Is the petitioner here? Thank you. Could staff provide, case 2010-003, the request is a variance from the required minimum lot coverage per AMC 2140. Staff provide us with the sufficiency of notice, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On December 21st, 2009, a total of 70 public hearing notices were mailed. None have been returned at the time this report was written. 70 public hearing notices were mailed. We have many that have been returned. The stack of papers that were set out in front of each of the commissioners laid on the table tonight, and other late comments from the public were received, all in support of the variance.
Thank you. Would you proceed with your presentation?
Thank you. On March 15, 2010, the petitioner submitted supplemental information to be included with the application for this variance. Enclosed is the supplemental information. The staff report was prepared in January and remains unchanged. That is to say that the staff report is just as it was when it was handed out a couple months ago. There's been additional information that's been provided. That's the whole stack of papers that have been handed out for you tonight. And this sort of the first 17 pages of the packet labeled H1. So H1.1, 1.2, 1.3, all the way up to it goes to 17, and that's information, additional information that the petitioner has provided to try and give context in the history of this case. Again, there are numerous letters of support from the community, from the neighborhood, provided by the petitioner in support of a 2% variance for lot coverage. Color photos were also submitted by the petitioner. That's also in one of the handouts. There are some photos taken of the property to supplement the photos that were already included in the packet. Page H.1.6, I guess about the 6th page in from the front of the packet, gives an excellent as-built of the property, and that's probably the most current as-built, the one to work from. I'm going to begin on page 2 of the packet. In 2001, the owner of this property applied for a variance to allow lot coverage to exceed 30%. The request was to allow a house at the time approximately 32 to 33% lot coverage from a 1996 expansion to be further expanded to approximately 35% lot coverage. The request was denied based on the 6 standards in effect at the time. The current owner has worked over the intervening time to reduce, this is a different owner than before, has worked over the intervening time to reduce the lot coverage of the house, and this request is for a 31 to 32% lot coverage variance. The owner does not qualify for administrative variance. Standard 1 does not appear to be substantially met. The requested variance does not arise from the physical conditions of the land itself, such as creeks, wetlands, steep slope, etc., which is peculiar to the land of this site, and which would have limited the ability to construct within the code requirements of this site. However, the petitioner has worked to try and reduce the land, the excessive coverage that it had before. Standard number 2 does not appear to be substantially met. This is a neighborhood of many large homes, but also of smaller-sized homes. 5,000 square feet living area based on property appraisal records. This home is at parity with other houses in the neighborhood. Strict application of the code would not deprive the petitioner of rights enjoyed by the other properties in the same zoning district. Standard number 3 does not appear to be substantially met. There's no, as we stated in condition, or in standard number 1, there's no physical circumstances which prevent rights commonly enjoyed by other property owners. There's no significant slope, stream, wetland, or physical impediment. The need for the variance is a result of actions of the applicant. The applicant did not build the original house in 1981, but the original excess lot coverage, 33%, resulted from the 1996 expansion of the house by the owner. It was pointed out that the building permit reviewer at the time, the lot coverage would be exceeded. In 2001, the applicant requested a further expansion to 35%. That was not approved. Over the intervening time, the applicant has tried to reduce the size of the home and bring the house as closely as possible into compliance with the 30% maximum lot coverage. Standard number 4, standard is substantially met. The standard assumes that the violation will not be injurious to the neighborhood or detrimental to public welfare if a variance is granted. He meets this standard. There's no structure separation violations. Drainage and runoff do not appear to be an issue. The encroachment is not visually obvious. There have been I think a couple objections from the community in the original case. There's a large number of comments that have been submitted by the petitioner in support of granting of the variance. Standard number 5 is substantially met. Current owner has worked to reduce the lot coverage from the 2001 request. Reducing the lot coverage is moving the house towards conformity with the code. The requested variance is dimensional and not a use variance. The over lot coverage does not change the character of the zoning district. Standard number 6, the standard is substantially met. There are no identified health or safety issues. Standard number 7 appears to be partially met. The petitioner could remove portions of the house exceeding the maximum allowable lot coverage, although there would be structural issues to be resolved. A reasonable use of the land would still exist. On the other hand, 32% lot coverage would fall under the administrative variance if the case had qualified for this type of review. So in that sense, the variance is a minimum request. It's required that all 7 standards are substantially met. The department finds that standards 1, 2, and 3 are not substantially met. If after the public hearing the board finds that all 7 standards are met, then it should be approved subject to conditions 1, 2, and 3 on pages 5 and 6 of the packet. They require a notice of zoning action. They require for an as-built to be submitted, and they require that the building is not increased in size, and that is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. Are there any questions of staff? Yes, Mr. Rowan.
Through the Chair, Ms. McLaughlin, a question about the comments received and placed on our desk this evening. You mentioned that all comments were in support of the variance request. About 6 pages in, I'm having trouble discerning a comment issued by P. Taylor. So 6 full pages in, it's on the back side of a page.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. I noticed that one too. I couldn't read it myself. That may not be in support of the variance. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Vig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McLaughlin, on page 2 of the packet, it describes that in 2001 there was a request to expand the house, which had been expanded in '96, and at the time of the 2001 construction, it covered between 32 and 33% of the lot. Is that correct?
My understanding of the history is that there were additions made to the house without a building permit, and then in 2001 they applied for an expansion of the house, and it was discovered then that the house was in excess of the allowed lot coverage, and the variance to increase the size of the house was denied, and now they're seeking a variance for what exists of the house now.
Okay. And just to clarify, that your understanding is the '96 expansion, there were no permits issued for that construction?
Yes, I believe that is correct. The petitioner is here to speak to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Burkhart.
Yes, you mentioned that this wouldn't qualify for administrative variance. Could you recap briefly why that's not available to the petitioner?
My understanding is that although this may fall within the criteria of an approval, within the allowed limits of an administrative variance, that because this was done without a building permit, that it was more of a deliberate action rather than a discovered mistake on the part of the builder. That is to say, when the contractor builds something and is off by a couple inches or a foot, they may apply for an administrative variance. In this case, there was no building permit applied for, and therefore it is not eligible for this administrative variance, administrative application that can be reviewed by the Land Use Review Division of the Planning Department. Thank you.
Are there any other questions of staff? And just one follow-up question. The amount of the variance falls within that, within what?
Yes, it is.
What would be granted?
Yes.
Follow up to Mr. Burkhart's question. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions of staff? Seeing none, will the applicant come forward, please? Or applicant's representative? If you'd state and spell your name for the record, please.
My name is Dan Bowles, B-O-L-L-E-S. Barbara Donatello has asked me to represent her here tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. And you have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Oh, thank you. As staff has conveyed to you, this does represent a request for variance of basically less than 2%. And Ms. Donatello has worked very hard to reduce that from the 5% that her husband had built the house to, bringing it down to the point that now where it will cause structural damage to actually bring the house down any farther. And we'll deal with that here in a second. I did want to clarify, as far as 2001, there was a permit issued. Permit number 2001-1266 is the permit number for the addition. Mr. Donatello did obtain that. And that permit has been revived here in December so that Mrs. Donatello can now remove those sections that her husband put on there. This whole process has been exacerbated by the fact that her husband proceeded without, by going beyond what was legal at the time. He did obtain permits for it. They were signed off by the municipality. However, he did add on beyond what was approved. However, it was exacerbated in that once he was denied his variance, he just left it. Then he left not only the state of Alaska, but he left the country. So Barbara has been left with trying to fix all this. And during that period, she was not with him in the house, so she has been separated from him for a number of years. So getting into the variance here, you can tell from the photos that we provided there that we have tried to comply as much as we can on this. Also, the second page, you see the lot does have a slope. It drops 10 feet from the front of the house to the back of the house. And this top photo on that shows you down by the railroad the fill that's been put into that property. So originally, the property had a much larger drop to it. And we bring this up because, with all deference to Thibodeau, the first section of this of the requirement for a variance is done in the disjunctive as opposed to the conjunctive, which the Juneau zoning code is written conjunctively. So then the applicant must decide which way to go. Is an exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstance? And it's interesting because the examples that they provide on page 5 of the application indicate avalanche hazard zones. Avalanche hazard zone is not a physical characteristic of the property, but a characteristic which contributes to the need. As in our application, we stated that this lot is in a seismic hazard zone 4. Also, it is in a wind zone of 120 miles an hour, and the exposure, it's on the bluff. It is the highest exposure you can get in the municipality, Anchorage, for wind. In both those instances, we feel that there is a reason for granting the variance to allow this remaining 1.2% of the house in this instance, because all your tie downs and everything for the corners of that house tie in there into the solid foundation. If you were to ask her to remove that back 3 feet, she would have to cut those corners out, and you would end up with a substandard building in the event of an earthquake or a wind event. I've been here for 45 years, and while I appreciate an avalanche zone being mentioned here in the information, I find that I have yet to hear of an avalanche taking out a house in the River or Anchorage area. But I do know of houses that have been demolished by wind in the Anchorageville area. And I do know that there have been houses damaged by earthquakes in the Anchorage area. So I feel that the hazard zone for seismic and wind does put the structure and life of the persons in there at harm if we try to move that wall back that 3 feet that she's going to have to do. then that would go to point number 3 as well, that the special conditions or circumstances, if you were to, or more than just an inconvenience, and that removing the encroachment would severely damage the structure. So we feel that points 1 and 3 are fully met here. And we would consider, please, that you would talk with Mr. Seymour here concerning the structural comments that he's made, and also with Mrs. Donatelli about her presence in the house and what's transpired there in her relationship with her husband as far as not being a part of this, because she has not been a part of this, and that is why we say that this should be heard as if she was a new owner. Let's see. And so with that, I'd entertain any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. If you wish us to ask questions of Ms. Donatelli or anyone else, we may or may not ask the questions you want us to ask. I'm not sure how much time you have. You have 3 minutes remaining, and if that is if you're concluding your presentation, so be it. But I just want to be clear, we just ask questions to clarify thoughts we have, not necessarily what you may want us to ask.
All right. I'm Barbara Donatelli. I'm actually the petitioner here this evening, and as he said, Mr. Dan Bowles was representing me here, as well as Mr. Seymour, who I worked with regarding taking a look at the structure of the house and what could be actually removed. I began this when I realized I was going to be stuck dealing with the situation. I currently have a home that I live in another part of South Anchorage, and when I realized that whether I was going to sell the house on Jarvie Drive or move back in there, that would clearly have to work with the municipality and resolve the situation in order to be able to do anything with the house. And so I have really been trying to do that in good faith since I realized that this problem was dropped in my lap and I would have to be the one to do it. So I contacted David Seymour. He worked with me to get current as-built surveys to look at the work that had been done, look at the additions that had been put on, gather the background information, and came up with recommendations for what could be reasonably removed from the structure. I did that. I spent quite a bit of money actually to tear off things that were otherwise, very fine parts of the house, but it could be done so without harming the structural integrity of the property. I took off a shed on the side of the house that was actually built with siding to match that enclosed things like the garbage cans and shovels and that kind of thing, but clearly this was trying to put the property as close as possible into compliance. Mr. Seymour applied for an administrative variance for me in early July of this year. It was denied. He did not receive a response back as to why that was denied. And up until the time that we decided to go ahead and apply for this variance, which was in late October, I signed the document on October 22nd of this year, of 2009. We didn't learn until in January when the staff analysis and recommendation came out that the reason the administrative variance was denied because it said that the petitioner, it was a deliberate, overbuild on the part of the petitioner. I guess you could say that at that time back in 2001, my husband James Donatelli applied for a permit and was the one who added on. But as we've pointed out verbally in the documents, I have not lived in the house since 2001 and was really not involved in that process. I am doing what I can to really try to resolve this situation, and so I sort of felt that it was a little bit of going back and forth between things like owner-applicant and to sort of, after I've torn off part of the house, to say that the overbuild was my responsibility. So I just point these things out. I'm not a scofflaw. I'm not here trying to take on City Hall or that kind of thing. I'm just really trying to, in a reasonable sort of way, come up with a solution and get back in compliance here so I can move forward, complete this remodel. I've actually decided I love that neighborhood, and I want to finish the remodel, move back there, and sell the house I'm currently living in now. And so that's what I'm here before you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Donatelli. Are there questions of the applicant? Mr. Barrett?
Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification, both for the staff and for the applicant. The reason this cannot be an administrative variance, although it does fall numerically within the dimensional tolerance, administrative variances are after-the-fact variances when, at some time following a certificate of occupancy or some other closure, it is then at that time discovered there has been a problem, in this case going over the lot coverage. The over-the-lot coverage for this particular case has been known for many years. It's not an after-the-fact, and that's why it's not an administrative variance. That was all. Thank you.
Mr. Vig?
Well, I'll start by asking the petitioner if I found where I had seen in the property history, it lists permit 1996-0440, building permit to expand house and lot coverage exceeded, is noted on page 2 of the packet. Do you know the circumstances of that situation that happened in 96 when the permit was issued and the coverage was exceeded?
So you're referring to the 96 expansion versus the 2001?
Yeah, I'm curious when I was asking Mr. McLaughlin about it, whether it was known at that time as part of that permitting process, and during the closeout of that permit, if it was observed that the coverage was being exceeded at that time. And
I'm really not as familiar with the 1896 permit as I have been of the 2001. I would like to clarify, though, I believe it was mentioned by staff that the addition in 96 was done without a permit, and that's clearly not the case because you know the number of that permit. Dan, do you know the specifics of it?
The 96 permit was issued without the front overhang being indicated on the plot plan. And so there was a mathematical error in the lot coverage at that time. In the 2001 permit, when Mr. Donatelli came back, he indicated on there that he would remove certain things, and then once he got his permit, he then added them back. So that was that's how we ended up where we're at now.
Thank you. I don't know if it's appropriate to ask Mr. Barrett for clarification on what you just said, but if I'm reading this correctly, in 1996, a permit had been issued to expand the house, and lot coverage was noted to have been exceeded by 2 to 3%, and now we're, which, if I understood you correctly, would have been an administrative situation because it was something that happened during the closeout of the permit, and now we're looking at a 1 to 2% amount above the maximum?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vig, I'll rely on Mr. Bowles to help me with this as well. The history is getting back there. In 1996, Mr. Donatelli pulled a permit. He exceeded what he had shown in the permit. In 2001, when he came in for a change to the permit, it was noted that he had exceeded what he had requested in 96. Then he also continued to exceed what he requested in the 2001 permit. That's how we go from the 3233, which was bumped up as a result of the overbuild from the 96 permit, up to the 35%, which was the additional bump over and beyond what was permitted in the 2001 permit. I don't think at any point this would have qualified for an administrative variance, because what was shown on the permits is not what was built. The permits were indicated for certain amounts of lot coverage, and then the actual construction exceeded those. If they were the results of a building error or of a calculation error, it's possible it might have counted or it might have been able to be included as an administrative variance. But by the time this first came to the zoning board, we had already jumped from the permitted amount of 30% up to 35%, so we were long past that stage.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Bigg. Are there other questions of the applicant by the board? Mr. Rowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Mr. Bowles. You raised issue of conjunctive versus disjunctive regarding Standard 1 and following through with a few other standards. The conjunctive that I'm interested in is the latter part of that standard requirement, and that's and such physical circumstances are not applicable to other land in the same district. So the issues you raised with wind and earthquake, are those unique to this particular property, or do they also apply to other land within the same district?
To the chair, Mr. Rowan. Of course, they would apply to other land. And as is noted with anything, even if you're talking about a lot that's a swamp, there are other swamps in Anchorage. Anchorage is 68% swamp. So to or wetlands. So to sit there and say, it has to 100% be this lot and this lot only is a physical impossibility. But when you have a convergence of not one but two hazard zones on one piece of property, that is fairly rare. Of course, all lots on the bluff, whether a Canoic or Trinity arm, are going to be in a seismic hazard zone, and they're going to be in a wind zone. But because of those circumstances, there is a need here not to take away the integrity of that foundation and that structure. As the pictures show, that's a two-story structure. And should you suffer any damage in an earthquake, and you take away the integrity of that foundation, you're going to damage that structure more than if it's in one solid piece. And you're going to cut it, and you're going to make a seam there. And then you're going to try to patch that back together. It just will not hold like the original pour. And in the permit, municipality required a third again of steel in that foundation than a normal foundation. Plus the tie downs, everything that you have to do from the roof through the foundation has to be one solid component. So yes, we feel that it does have an application here.
Thank you. If I could follow up, you raised issues of structural integrity. Will we get a chance to hear from Mr. Seymour? My next question pertains to that particular issue. I can reserve it if we will hear from him.
I think the event is available for questions.
Yes, he's available for questions. I can refer to him.
I don't believe he can. They've exceeded their 10 minutes as far as the presentation, but
he's open for questioning.
They've indicated so.
Yes, I'll defer to him.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Moore.
Could you state and spell your name for the record, please?
Yes, my name is David Seymour. I'm a professional building designer. I've been designing in Anchorage for about 40 years. My last name is spelled Seymour.
Thanks.
Mr. Seymour, I'm trying to file through all the resources I have in front of me and get everything straight. I see a letter from you on page 38 of the staff packet, and it's to Ms. Inglis, I believe. And as best as I can tell, this is the only reference that you've made to compromising the integrity of the structure. Am I missing something, or is there a more formal, direct statement that you make about it?
No, this is the letter I wrote, yes.
Okay. That was my question. Looking at the site plan and notes you had, just wondering if there are any other more direct comments about how the proposed or potentially required revisions to the house might damage the structural integrity of it.
Well, because it's so close to the inlet, and because it's on the bluff, and we do have seismic situation there, and we also have high winds. Even though the winds have been indicated as higher, there is what they call exposure D, which is when you're close enough to a body of water within a quarter mile, there's always a possibility of high winds. So even though the wind zone there is probably 100 to 110 on the map, it actually should be higher because of where it's located on the bluff there.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions of the applicant? I did have one follow-up question, and I think you've alluded to it, probably stated it a couple times, but excuse the phrase, has all the low-hanging fruit been taken as far as what can be done to minimize the lot coverage, and now anything left, we're talking the foundation of the footprint, something would have to be relocated?
Yes, as I mentioned, we'd have to take a little more than 3 foot of that addition, that 16 by 20 addition. We'd have to push it back into the house a little more than 3 feet.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. With that, we will open it up to public testimony. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? If you state and spell your name for the record, please.
My name is James Armstrong. Last name is spelled A-R-M-S-T-R-O-N-G.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong. You have 3 minutes.
Okay, I came out in support of the applicant. I live down the street at 13920 Drivey Drive, and over the years, the house has, been under construction. Construction has stopped. Miscellaneous cars parked in the driveway, out on the lawn. I would like to see this come to a close. After learning the history, starting in 1996, going all the way to 2001, and now it's 2010, and we haven't closed a permit. Seems like a relatively minor item to take care of with the variance. If the permit had been closed out, maybe they're qualified for the administrative permit or, variance. So I was just coming out in support of this variance application, and I'm just afraid of further delay, that even if this ruling from this body is against the variance, that it may continue on and degrade the area of the neighborhood. Places under construction for 10 years doesn't look good on the neighborhood. There's still light fixtures and other items that are hanging off the side of the house. Like I said, I'd just like to see it buttoned up and be done with. And I was particularly glad to hear that there were a lot of respondents that were in support of this. They probably see the same thing I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Armstrong. Are there any questions of Mr. Armstrong? Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all?
My name is Betsy Peratrovich, and
Could you spell that last name?
Sure. Here, I've got it on my life. P as in Peter, E-R-A, T as in Tom, R-O, V as in Victor, I-C-H.
Thank you.
I've known Barbara for a number of years, and I know she's really worked hard to try and do the right thing here. I don't know a lot about this situation. I know that the percentage, she's really worked hard to bring down. And this is a hard situation, but I know she's really working to do the right thing. She's got a lot of support, and I just wanted to say she's trying hard.
Thank you. Are there any questions, Mrs. Bradovich? Thank you. Anyone else from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all? Seeing and hearing none, the public hearing is closed. Does staff have any further rebuttal? No, thank you. Does the applicant have any further rebuttal?
To the chair, to Mr. Wainwright, he had just thought about this. We talked about the page 6 of the supplemental here from P. Taylor. On that objection was to an encroachment on the yard setback. And that is not part of this variance. There is no encroachment on this house. So actually, when she says setback requirements, she may have been misinformed and misunderstood the purpose for the variance.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. Mr. Burkhart?
Yes, I've got a question. I thought I saw some reference in the packet that has this case been to the community council for their input?
We applied to them when they didn't have a meeting in December. They didn't have a meeting in January. February, Barbara Donatello showed up, and there was no meeting again. She was to go previously this month. Again, no meeting there. Hopefully there'll be a meeting next month.
Thank you.
With that, the matter rests with the board. Could I have a positive motion from a board member, please? Have we moved on to? I'm sorry, Mr. Burkhart, did you move?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to understand my screen, I guess. I apologize for that pause. Mr. Burkhart, you care to make your motion?
I can withdraw the motion if the chair...
No, just a little slow tonight, I guess.
In case 2010-003, I move we grant a variance from AMC 21.40.030.H to allow an existing residential structure to exceed the maximum allowable 30% lot coverage. If the variance is approved, lot coverage would be approximately 31, and I think it's intended to be, or 31 to 32%. Subject to department recommendation items on 1, 2, and 3 on page 5 and 6 of the packet.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Vig, you've indicated you've seconded that motion?
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Burkhart, would you speak to your motion, please?
I think that standard number 1 is at least partially met. I don't think it's fully met. We've had testimony here that the lot is affected by seismic and wind exposure criteria. That does apply to other properties along the bluff as well as the slope affected. But in this case, I think those exposures do have some impact, so I find that this is at least partially met. Standard number 2, strict application of the code would create an exceptional or undue hardship upon the property owner and would deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same district under the terms of the zoning ordinance. I think this is at least partially met from the perspective that if this had qualified for an administrative variance, that the parts of the house that have been removed here would have come in within that same tolerance. So I think it's the mechanism to which it got to this case, not applying or not being eligible for the administrative variance, but in effect another building would be that went through the process that was eligible for administrative variance would be approved if it was under that 32% cap. And so in that respect, I think it's essentially the same thing. So I don't think that we're extending any favoritism or extra benefits to this property owner that wouldn't be available through the administrative variance process. Standard 3, I think, is also at least partially met. That the string of ownership of a property, we've been told by the legal department, even carries from one property owner to the next in terms of the hardship being self-imposed, just because a variance does run from property owner to property owner. I think we've got a quite unique case in terms of Mrs. Donatelli and Mr. Donatelli having their differences over the additions to the house and such. I was on the board in 2001 when this first came to the board, and I think I recall us asking, Mr. Donatelli if he would be willing to remove any portions and decrease the extent of the variance that was being requested, and I believe that he declined to do that. I think it's important into this case in terms that Mrs. Donatelli has done whatever's structurally reasonable to decrease the amount of nonconformance in terms of lot coverage. So once again, I think that's at least partially met. I agree with staff that I think that that standard 4 is substantially met. I believe in terms of one of the add-ons in terms of storage that was removed was from the side of the property, and I think in terms of lot coverage, the thing that's most important to me is the view corridors, the peaks that you get from driving down the road, seeing between the buildings, seeing the inlet and the beyond. And I think in terms of the removal of that particular piece of lot coverage, I think it does improve the view corridors from the street between the houses. I think standard 5, I agree with staff that I think that's substantially met. I think standard 6 is substantially met. I guess I also note that, yes, that we have quite a few letters or non-objections and support for the variance request from the people in the neighborhood that responded to the public notice, and also to the people who showed up here tonight. And in this case, I think it does meet standard 7. I think there's been a lot of work done here by the property owner to try to bring the property back into conformance. Our ordinance says that we have to find that all 7 standards are substantially met. I think the first 3 standards, even though they're only partially met, I think if you look at this whole as one body, I think that standard has met, so I intend to support the variance request.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Vig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to standard number 1, in addition to the items identified by the petitioner and Mr. Burkhart, that being seismic and wind, I think it's important to consider also the proximity of the railroad, which on a daily basis, if not more frequently, would transmit moving wheel loads and vibrations and whatnot to the petitioner's property, and is another consideration that I think, in my mind, takes it from a partially met to a substantially met situation. And with regard to standard number 2, the strict application of this code, I believe, would create an undue hardship on the property owner in being required to make major structural modifications to the building, which may make it difficult for it to withstand the items that we've just talked about in standard number 1. And also in standard number 3, the hardship being self-imposed, I think this is a rather unique situation, and it seems that since Mrs. Donatelli has gotten involved herself, she's done everything possible to remedy the overbuild that happened in sounds like in '96 and in 2001. And it isn't clear to me, but it's conceivable anyway that some of the parts that were removed were maybe some of those that were even built in '96 that created this in the first place. So I think that I would find that at least partially and probably substantially met. Standard number 4, I think I agree with staff on that this variance would not affect use of adjacent property. And standards 5, 6, and 7, I also agree with staff's findings that they are, 5 and 6, I should say, being substantially met. And standard 7, I think, is also substantially met in that this is really the minimum possible without making major structural modifications to the building. So I intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I intend to support the motion as well for the reasons stated by my fellow board members. In looking at department recommendations, however, specifically recommendation 3, I'd like to offer a friendly amendment if it's reasonable to do so. As currently stated, it says the approved lot coverage variance shall automatically become null and void if the approved variance, the structure is altered, enlarged, or expanded in any way. And the friendly amendment would be to strike the word altered from that recommendation.
I'd accept that as a friendly amendment.
I would too.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ron. Are there any other questions or comments from any of the board members? Seeing none, please vote. That motion passes with 6 vote of 6-0. I should read that any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision.
We wish to thank the board.
I'm sorry?
We wish to thank the board.
Oh. You're welcome. That brings us to our second case this evening, case 2010-004. Is the petitioner, or are the petitioners, Daniel and Lois Gross, here this evening? They've indicated they are. If you'll work your way forward, perhaps we could have a staff presentation on the sufficiency of notice.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On December 21st, 2009, 139 public hearing notices were mailed. At the time this report was written, 2 responses were received in support of the variance. No community council response has been received.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. If you'll proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a part of background for this case, the owners of this property hired a contractor to build a carport on the front of the house, covering the front door and the driveway to help the couple with a medical condition and to provide safety on the driveway and the walkway to the front of the house. The contractor was not a good one. It was not a good choice. He was not licensed, bonded, did not obtain a building permit, and it was discovered that the carport is not structurally sound. The carport must be taken down, so the family is out the cost of this improvement, plus the cost of having to take it down. The original request for a variance is an as-built of that original request is on page 4 of the packet. You can see an as-built with the original sort of site plan, and on the first page you'd see that they were seeking a variance to encroach both into the front yard setback and into the rear yard setback. The front yard setback they were seeking to encroach 13 feet. Now they've revised the application. They no longer need to ask for a 13-foot variance for the front yard and a variance for the side yard. They're seeking only a 6.2-foot variance for the front yard for a new carport. So they're seeking this variance so that they could build a new carport that would encroach 6.2 feet. The as-built showing what they would like to build, what they're asking for now, is on page 3. So that would be the as-built to look from for the current variance request. Page 30 has some nice photos of the property from the street. Pages 22 and 23 have public comments in support of the variance. Also, there's a late comment that could not be included in the staff packet that is also in support of the variance. The petitioner has revised and reduced the amount of their variance for construction of a new, smaller 328-square-foot carport that will encroach 6.2 feet in the front yard, and they withdrew the side yard variance. This allows covered parking and entry into the house and does not exceed the allowed 30% lot coverage. The original variance request involved a carport constructed without a building permit and that encroached 13 foot into the front yard and 2.5 feet into the side yard, with an unintended consequence of exceeding the 30% lot coverage by 4.7%. Homestead Acres subdivision is a very old subdivision in Midtown neighborhood. It was platted in the early 1960s. The subject lot is legally conforming and meets the minimum area and width requirements. The lot is an irregular 5-sided lot. The single-family ranch building is conforming to the required yard setbacks and measures 29.8 feet from the house to the front lot line and 7 feet or greater from each side yard lot line. Standard 1 appears not to be met. The lot is legally conforming in the R1 district. The house is legally conforming to the front and side yard setbacks, 29.8 feet from the front yard lot line, 7 feet from the side yards. The land is flat. There are no streams, wetlands associated with the property. They could build a carport that would only be, they could build a 10-foot carport that would conform to the front yard setback. That extra 6.2 feet is to allow them space to walk around a car while it's parked without having to pull it all the way up to the building. Standard 2 appears to be partially met, although there are no unusual physical circumstances adhering to the lot or to the land. The need for the variance arises from the desire by the property owner to make their home handicap accessible for themselves in their retirement. Both are retired, and one of the spouses has medical problems. They have no garage or covered parking, which is common to many Anchorage single-family homes. To eliminate snow shoveling the driveway from the driveway and to provide safe covered walkway to the front entrance, they wish to construct a new 328 square foot carport. Most homes in the neighborhood appear to have garages constructed in a conforming manner to the setbacks. The petitioner believes a carport is in keeping with the neighborhood by pointing to 2 other properties on Waldron that have carports in the front of each house. The 20-foot by 18-foot carport at 2398 Waldron Drive was constructed in 1989. No record of a building permit or a variance. We cannot verify whether the carport encroaches into the front yard setback, but it appears to. The carport at 2385 Waldron is a legally non-conforming structure constructed prior to zoning and has legal non-conforming characteristics of use. It's worth noting that the carport that they are proposing to build would not be as visually obtrusive as a garage. A carport is significantly less visually obtrusive than a garage because it is, after all, just a roof and not a building addition. Standard number 3 is not met. There is no peculiarity relating to the natural or physical condition of the land. And then the second part of that, the need for the variance is a result of the actions of the applicant. The petitioner states that they will tear down the existing carport, and if this variance is approved, will get a proper building permit to construct a smaller carport. Personal hardship shall not be considered as grounds for a variance, since the variance will continue to affect the character of the neighborhood after the title of the property is passed. Standard number 4 appears to be met. A 6.2-foot encroachment will improve visibility, especially as this is a carport and not a garage. A property across the street from this lot has legally non-conforming rights to a carport with the setback as it pre-existed current zoning. No other variants were found in the area. Many responses have been received in support of the variance. Standard 5 is met. Requested variance is dimensional. It's not a use variance. Standard 6 appears to be met. Standard number 7 is met. This revised 31% front yard encroachment variance is a lesser variance than the initial 65% variance into the front yard. By reducing the size and scale of the carport from 673 square feet to 328 square feet, the petitioner has withdrawn the 2 previous side and front yard encroachments, will tear down the existing 673 square foot carport constructed without a building permit and eliminate the need for a variance exceeding 30% lot coverage. This is the minimum variance necessary to provide for a safe covered parking area. The department recommends denial as not all the standards are substantially met. if after the public hearing the board establishes findings that each of the 7 standards is substantially met, the department recommends the approval of the as-built of the requested variance, subject to condition 1, which has 3 parts on pages 11 and 12. That's recording a notice of zoning action, a demolition of the existing carport, approval, there's conditions 2, 3, and 4, approval of the 6.2 feet encroachment into the 20-foot front yard setback, obtaining a building permit for the demolition of the existing carport and constructing a new one according to the the provided site plan on as-built on page 3, and carport is prohibited from being converted into a living space or enclosed to become a garage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. Are there any questions of staff by the board? I do have a question. Mr. McLaughlin, did you prepare, we had, as part of our original staff packet, there were 3 color photos, the third one being an 11 by 17 aerial. Were those prepared by staff, or where did this come from? It says 2007 aerial.
Through the chair, page 13 shows an aerial that's pretty difficult an aerial photo. It's pretty difficult to make out, but it shows the location of the house and the lot and how it's sort of oddly shaped. Also, page 14 shows another sort of drawing of the parcel. Pages 30 and 31 have some photos as part of the applicant's application, photos from the street and photos of the substandard structurally insecure existing carport. There's another, I guess, plat, the original plat. It's a P plat, one of the older plats in town, on page 32. I'm standing in for someone else that wrote the case. I apologize if I don't have that background for you.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm inferring that the first two pages are included as far as I think you had mentioned on 30 and 31. Yeah, page 30. I guess where I was going, just curious, the adjacent properties, I can't tell. I know there's discussion in the packet on driveways or carports. Do you have any indication on the neighboring properties?
Through the chair, I am looking at this aerial for the first time. There's one that's not available to you, but is included in the case file, and it shows that across the street from the existing, from the petition site, is a legally non-conforming carport or garage. I forget which, and then. 6 doors down, there's either a carport or garage that appears to encroach into the front yard setback that doesn't have a variance.
Yeah, that's the photo I'm looking at, so I think that we all do have that. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. I can't speak to how many other houses on this block within this zoning district have carports and garages, but that might be a better question addressed by the petitioner.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Burkhart?
Yes, I'm looking at page 5 of the packet, and I see that the property appraiser records a single-family house with an attached 224 square feet, one-car garage in 1955, and I guess the property was platted in 62, so it seems unusual to me, number one, that the house preceded the plat unless it was the first thing that was built in and was a homestead. I guess the other thing is that it remarks that there was a one-car garage. Do you know if there was a garage previously, and has that been turned into, interior living area, or if not, I can ask the petitioner.
Please direct the question to the petitioner. I don't have the answer to that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions of staff by the board? Seeing none, could the applicant come forward, please? Can you state and spell your name for the record?
My name is Lois, L-O-I-S, Walter, W-A-L-T-E-R, Gross, G-R-O-S-S, or Mrs. Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L-H, Gross.
Thank you, Mrs. Gross. You have 10 minutes to make your presentation, and as you may have inferred, we have to find that all 7 standards are met in order to grant a variance. So if you could have your presentation geared towards those 7 standards, please.
All right. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Lois Walter Gross, or Mrs. Daniel H. Gross. My husband, Dan, and I would like to thank everyone involved with this case for their time, effort, and concern regarding the carport. We have tried to work with the Planning Zoning Department after realizing problems did exist. We are here tonight to state that we will tear down the existing larger carport if necessary, and if the variance is approved, we'll get a proper building permit to construct a smaller carport based upon the amendment variance request in the letter found on page 24A in your packet from Karen Cushman, a building designer and owner of Interlochen Design Company. We hope that you will make a final decision tonight with this issue, since it has continued for such a long time. As to the history of the carport, I'd like to make a few comments. Our interest to build the carport in the first place was due to physical and medical needs. My husband had a heart four-way bypass operation in 2003, and they had to take many veins and arteries from his legs to help his heart, to keep him moving. And so from that day on, we decided we were going to have to make a decision, which was we were either going to sell the house and buy another one here in Alaska, or we were going to remodel the house, which we eventually did, with handicap bars, a carport, or we were going to leave Alaska and go to the East Coast where our family is and live somewhere there. Well, our decision, as you see, is we decided to build a carport. We are both retired, and we are 68, and we think you understand, as you go through life, you have different needs. And we're in the chapter where we need coverage from snow removal, ice, and
on anything that would cause a problem for us physically. My husband has used a wheelchair. He has had a walker, and we were hoping that we could have the car located close to the front door. There are no steps because it's a ranch style, and have him be easily accessible to the car with either walking, as I said, or wheelchair or walker. Those were our intents. We made a big mistake when we had a carport built, however. Our mistake was based upon ignorance and inexperience of permits, rules, procedures, limitations, and changes of rules over the years, because we have lived in the house since 1980. Unfortunately, the man we paid to know these things, the man we trusted, was not a good choice on our part. The contractor said everything was okay, then left the state. Since the summer of 2008, we have tried to work with the municipality by hiring professionals to help educate us in our rights and limitations regarding the carport. A lawyer, an engineer, a designer. There was a new as-built done, 2 letters of non-objection from the utility companies, and 3 different senior planners taking our case. We especially want to thank Mary Arthur, our present senior planner, who always spoke to us in a professional manner and presented us with facts from which we were able to work with him and hopefully make right the wrongs we had unknowingly committed. If there are any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Thank you, Mrs. Gross. We have just wanted to refer there's some handwritten variance standards on pages 21 through 24 of our staff packet, and I'm just assuming those are your response. Again, get back to the 7 standards.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The staff has indicated that there bear with me. Standards 1 and 3, they do not feel are met specifically. And I don't know if you may not know what those standards are off the top of your head. I have to read them all the time as well. Is there any additional discussion you could provide on why you think those 2 standards are met? The first standard being the physical circumstances of the subject property having exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances.
I believe my understanding is the answer to whatever was wrong. I believe the person right here, at the bottom of page 5, background revised lesser variance request. I was hoping that perhaps that might alleviate the problem for number 1 and number 3, where it says the petitioner has revised and reduced the amount of their variance for construction of a new smaller 328 square foot carport that would encroach 6.2 feet into the front yard setback and withdrew the side yard variance. This allows covered parking and entry into the house and does not exceed the allowed 30% maximum lot coverage. And then the last paragraph in the first and third paragraph down on page 6, where it starts with the petitioner requested postponement, It indicates the Interlaken Design Company. And that letter is on page 24A, regarding the amendment variance request for carport encroachment. Do you have that letter?
Yes, I do. I have all of those. And
the figures, the numbers, evidently, as I understand it, that Mrs. Cushman spoke to me about, will alleviate most of the problems that were, I don't know if it does too, but it seemed that it would alleviate the problem with over 30% coverage. It would alleviate the encroachment on the southwest side. It would alleviate the 13 feet towards the front and request instead 6.2.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions of the applicant by the board? Mr. Burkhart.
I see that in your standards that you've been in the house since 1980, approximately?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you weren't anywhere in the neighborhood when the house was first built or anything like that? That when you bought it, that there was no single-car garage, that everything is habitable living area on the interior?
When we bought the house, it had had a garage, but somewhere the people that lived in it before we did cut the garage in half and made half of the garage a kitchen, which left only a small area that we use now as a utility room. And my husband has his desk in there. You cannot get a 15-foot car in there at all, so we just couldn't try. So that's what happened to the garage. It had a garage originally, but evidently whoever was in there before remodeled it into a kitchen.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions of the applicant? Seeing none, thank you. We will open the hearing up for public testimony. If you'd have a seat for a second, Mrs. Gross.
Okay, I think you had wanted to know about the other carports in the street, if there were any other carports.
And I think that you're welcome to ask that. The photo had indicated, yes.
Okay, they're not garages. Now, I don't know about the garages that are within the homes, but I know there are two carports. On the plat, it shows that there's one diagonally from us on the corner, and there's another one at the other end of the block on our side, on the end of the street, or at the end of the street. So they're corner, both of them are corners.
And those are both carports?
They're both carports, yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there, you might not be going far, but I'll ask, is there anyone from the public wishing to testify in this case? Anyone at all? Seeing none, the public hearing is closed. Staff, does staff have any further rebuttal?
No, thank you, Chair.
Do you have any further rebuttal or comments you'd like to make on the case?
No, I don't.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Gross. You can have a seat.
Thank you.
With that, the matter rests with the board, and I would take a positive motion on this case, please. Mr. Ron.
Mr. Chair, I apologize. I actually have a question for staff. There was reference to the P-plat in 1962. Do we have access to seeing that? I'm trying to garner more information about the placement of the house on the lot, and if there's any likelihood that when constructed, city sewer wasn't available, and if it was serviced by an on-site well.
I believe on page 32 of our packet is it looks like it may be a portion of that plat, but it indicates plat P261B in the upper right corner.
Of course, without notes or information about.
Through the chair,
Yes.
plats do not show structures. A preliminary plat is required to show all structures, but final plats, that is a recorded plat, only shows rights-of-way, easements, and lot boundaries. No structures are shown because its plat is meant just to carry the easements and the lot boundaries.
To follow up, then, there are no previous as-built that we can reference for the site itself. And
that is correct.
thanks.
Don't know if that answered your question, Mr. Ron, but would you like to make a positive motion?
Someone would like to.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Would you care to make a motion?
Yes. In the case 2010-004, I move to grant a variance in the R1 district for a 31% variance from AMC 21.40.030G to allow a carport to encroach 6.2 feet into the required 20-foot front yard setback, according to Department recommendations 1 through 4 on pages 11 and 12 of the staff packet.
Thank you. Could I have a second, please? Ms. Denny, are you going to get you seconded that?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Ron, would you care to speak to your motion, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope I haven't done myself or the board a disservice. I don't feel like I have the level of argument necessary to support or deny the motion I've made at this point in time, and I look forward to other board members' comments regarding findings, staff findings, particular to standards 1 and 3. I asked a question about prior plats erroneously and perhaps meant prior as-built to learn more about the siting of the house on the lot, and looking at the aerial photograph that was referenced to, showing the portion of the neighborhood stretching between the subject property and Lake Otis. Of course, haven't measured it out, but it does look like the subject house is closer to that lot line than its neighbors. Now, to what degree that placing that house is an effect of the physical characteristics or lack of physical characteristics on the property, I don't know, but I'm trying to pull that into an argument and just don't know quite how to do it. And that it looks to me like the petitioner has less room to work with in their front yard than the neighbors do. I'm in agreement with staff for standards 2 in that finding that the standard is partially met and supportive of the petitioner's measures to reduce the degree of the variance, and tie standard 2 to standard 7, which staff pretty clearly states that this is the minimum variance requested to make a reasonable use of the land and provide safe covered parking for the petitioner. I agree with staff that standard 4, 5, and 6 are met as well. Realizing that we're not to take into great account the hardship placed on the petitioner themselves, but at some point safety should be brought into concern, not only for the petitioner but for the neighborhood and zoning district as a whole. That's the conclusion of my very muddled presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Appreciate your comments. Ms. Denny.
I agree with Mr. Ron in that it's a little bit difficult to justify Article 1, finding 1, but judging by the size of the lot and the placement of the house, I don't believe that there's any other choice as to what the petitioners are asking for. And that's not something that was their fault. They bought the house, and the house fits in with the neighborhood, and there's absolutely positively no other place, really, to put that carport. And it does, according to the little plat, it does appear that there's some type of an easement or something down one side. So even makes it narrower than it already is. Let's see, number 2, I also agree with staff that it's partially met. And on standard number 3, again, I would agree with Mr. Ron in addressing the safety issue for the petitioners. And also, if they ever sell the house, that it would also be a safety issue for following residents. And then I also agree with staff on 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Thank you, Ms. Denny. So you, just for clarification, you intend to support the motion then?
Yes, I do intend to support the motion.
Oh, okay, thank you. Are there any other comments from any of the board members? Mr. Burkhart. Oh, sorry, Mr. Fink, you're in the queue.
I think that there are a couple of unusual things here in terms of this house and the plat. As I mentioned earlier, that the property history indicates that the house was possibly built in 55 and that the neighborhood was platted in 1962. I see from the plat on page 32, and it's kind of like continued on page 36, that originally the lot that's to the west was a larger lot. It doesn't look like the plat extended to the property that's on the other side of Roger Street. And if this property was the first one that was developed in the neighborhood, that might give rise to supporting that there's somewhat of an unusual condition here in terms of the lot. I would also note from the 2007 aerial, in addition to the lot across the street in terms of the legal non-conforming garage or carport, and the one that says no variance down towards Lake Otis, that there also looks to be a house on the west corner of Roger and Waldron, I believe it is, that looks like it's a corner lot, and there looks to be a dark spot there in terms of either a garage or a carport. And on that lot, one of those would be a primary front yard, one would be a secondary front yard, but it appears that there's a pattern here through the development of, given the age of the buildings and the overall age of the plat, that there's a number of nonconformities in the neighborhood, and I think that has some effect. So I think standard 1 is at least partially met. Standard number 3, again, we have quite an unusual case here in terms of how we got to be where we are, in terms of a builder being hired and assuring the homeowners that everything that was happening there was to code. Obviously, from what we know now, that's not the case. And I think they've already spent a good deal of money and time in terms of what we consider, one of the rights to have protected parking. The board has recognized that in the past. And in terms of this second proposal, the smaller carport of really modest size, decreasing the amount of encroachment, and the path that the homeowner has taken to try to minimize the variance request, I think standard 3 is at least partially met.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Mr. Fink?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with my colleague in not supporting.
Is your microphone on?
Thank you. I conclude, I agree with my colleagues and intend on voting for the measure and applaud Mr. Ron for getting us there. I'm not going to comment on the standards anymore to say that I concur, but I do want to make one observation. For what it's worth, I'd just like to put it on the record. To the extent our code would preclude someone with a disability to make a normal or minimal and reasonable alteration to their home to enable them to live there as a disabled person, I think you run afoul of the ADA. I think this is a minimal and reasonable alteration that is necessary given his disability. So there's a preemption issue. I don't think we need to address it, but I think it's interesting enough, and it looks like the votes are here to support it. But I think that does potentially come into play in situations like this.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Burkhart.
I'd like to add one last item that I think a critical component here that allows me to likely vote in favor of this variance request is the staff recommendation number 4, is that the carport is prohibited from being converted to living space or being enclosed to become a garage. In terms of the, and I wanted to enforce that for the applicant, that because of its proximity to the road, being able to back out of that safely, that I think that's a very important component here, and I'm glad that staff included such a condition as that. I think that has, in effect, in terms of standard number 7 being the minimum variance that makes a reasonable use of the land.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. Are there any other comments? I guess I will weigh in, and this is a very tough case for me. I recognize recognize and empathize with the comments of the applicant, what they're trying to accomplish, and I commend them for the steps that they've taken. I'm conflicted with standards 1 and 3, and I appreciate the comments that have been made. The fact that there was an existing garage there with this house at some time. So I believe I can't support the motion finding that standards 1 and 3 are met. I think that there was a garage there at one time, and again, this goes with the land. So the petitioner, although it was a long time ago, not this petitioner, but the land this lot had a garage at one time, and now this is looking to encroach in the variance. They could put a carport that doesn't need to encroach into the right-of-way. So for those reasons, I don't intend to support the motion. Are there any other comments? If not, please vote. That motion passes by a vote of 5-1. So that variance is granted. In the state, any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon mailing of the written decision. Brings us to our last case of the evening. Case 2010-025, the applicant Lamar Johnson and Louisiana Cutler. I'm assuming the last two people here, the applicant. Mr. Barrett, I believe this is you. Could you provide us with the sufficiency of notice?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This variance request was advertised. The property was posted. 52 public hearing notices were mailed. We received 3 back, no objection. There was one with a minor objection, basically stating that they think the applicant should be granted a minimum variance, and all of those are in your package.
Thank you. Would you proceed with your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a request to allow a deck on a side yard to be replaced. The new deck would be a bit larger and would encroach the 25-foot side yard setback. The lot is a legal R6 property. It's pie-shaped, located at the end of a cul-de-sac. There is an approximate overall slope on the property of 16%. There's a 10-foot wide easement along the south property line that somewhat limits the buildable area of the property. The well and septic system locations on the property also pose some limitations on the location of the house. The existing house and deck date from 1994. The existing deck is approximately 26 feet from the lot line, and the applicant stated is in need of repair and or replacement. The owners would like to enlarge it at the same time so that it is comparable in size to other decks in the neighborhood. The existing deck is approximately 6 feet wide. The new deck, if approved, would be about 21 feet wide at its widest point. Regarding the standards, number one, that there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, the standards partially met. First, there is some slope associated with the property, but it's not severe, approximately 16%, and for the most part, that is in the backyard at the back property line. Further, the impact of the slope is not unique to the property. This is the upper hillside. The entire neighborhood has similar terrain. Secondly, the application states there is an underground stream which affected placement of the house. That's quite likely. Underground water is common on the hillside. Unfortunately, we do not know whether or not this is a unique situation. Underground streams are common. So even if it is related to the placement of the house, in this case, we can't say that it's unique to the area. There are no mapped streams on the property. Third, the lot is pie-shaped as it is at the end of the cul-de-sac, and this does place some constraints on house placement and yard setbacks. However, cul-de-sacs and pie-shaped lots are not uncommon in the area. Standard number two, because of the physical circumstances, strict application would create an exceptional or undue hardship. The standards also partially met. To deny the ability to build any deck would be a definite hardship because decks are common in the area. However, the existing deck, which is 6 feet wide, could be enlarged to be 7 feet wide and still meet the legal setbacks. There are photos of the existing deck for this property and decks of adjacent and nearby houses beginning on page 12, beginning on page 13 of the application. That's the subject. 14 is a close-up of the subject, and then on pages 15, 16, and 17 are photographs of the neighborhood. Standard number three, that the hardship is not self-imposed. This standard is not substantially met. Based on standard number one, there are some slight physical conditions affecting the property. However, they are not peculiar to this lot. They exist by and large throughout the neighborhood. The second part of that standard is that the owners built the house and they should have been aware of yard setbacks at the time of construction. If a larger deck had been anticipated at that time, it might have been possible to make some minor adjustments in the placement of the house and the septic system in order to allow for a somewhat larger deck. Standard 4, the variance, if granted, will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. That standard is substantially met. There are no structure separation issues. Drainage and runoff do not appear to be an issue. The size of the new deck, if approved, will be visually obvious because it will be going from 6 feet to over 20 feet in width. But this is an area of large lots. The lot line, the side lot line, is not clearly delineated, so it's not as though it will be a blight on the neighborhood and encroaching the neighbor whose side it is on. Standard number 5, the variance is in keeping with the intent of the code and will not change the character of the zoning district. That standard is substantially met. It's a dimensional request. Decks are common in the area, and a larger deck will not change the character of the zoning district. Standard 6, the variance does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare. Again, substantially met. No fire separation issues, no identified health or safety issues. Standard 7, that the variance is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. This standard is not substantially met. A deck is a reasonable addition to a home, especially on the upper hillside, to take advantage of the views. However, the standard is not met because a smaller deck could be built to either minimize or possibly even eliminate the encroachment and therefore eliminate the need for a variance. The existing deck could be widened, or a new deck could be built about 1 foot larger than the existing deck and still meet the 25-foot setback for the side yard. As standards 3 and 7 are not met, the department must recommend for denial. There are 2 conditions on page 9 should the board find for approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Are there any questions of staff by any of the board members? Seeing none, could the applicant come forward? And before you speak, I do have one question of staff. I'm sorry. The adjacent property lot, the most affected property, I believe lot 10 to the south, I thought I saw a letter in the file of support or non-objection to the variance. Is that correct? Correct. That's correct? You're doing Mr. Barrett's work for him? Yeah. Okay, and I will ask that question again. Could you state and spell your names for the record, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, my name is Louisiana Cutler. Louisiana spelled like the state, Cutler, C-U-T-L-E-R. This is my husband, Lamar Johnson.
L-A-M-A-R-J-O-H-N-S-O-N.
Thank you, and you have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you. As Mr. Barrett said, we seek to expand the size of our porch as shown on the as-built that's in your packet. The as-built is at page 2, or there's a larger version of it at page 33. Although much of the porch will not encroach on the side setback, a portion of it will, and that's the only portion where the statement that's made in the packet that the maximum encroachment would be 11.4 feet from the side lot line. That's the only portion of the porch that would encroach that far. The planning department analysis states that you should deny our application because some of the standards for obtaining a variance are not met. For the reasons stated in our application, we believe that all 7 are met, and we would respectfully request that you grant the variance. As Mr. Barrett said, the planning department claims that standards 1 and 2 are partially met, and standards 3 and 7 are not substantially met, and I'm only going to address in my remarks to those standards, not the ones that the planning department believes are met. With respect to the first one, the exceptional circumstances, This standard is fully met because of the underground stream that was on our lot that impacted the siting of the well and the septic. And that, in turn, dictated the placement of our house, which is very near the side setback, way down in the southeast corner of our lot. And at page 37 of your packet, there's the part of our application that explains this in further detail. The planning department talks about the slope. We don't think that's relevant. We're not seeking a variance because of the slope. The planning department claims that the underground streams and pie-shaped lots are common on the hillside. Respectfully, we would suggest to you that looking at the entire hillside is not what the variance ordinance requires. Where we live is off of Rabbit Creek between Evergreen and Golden View, and that's the area that we think is relevant. Yes, there are streams and there are irregular lots all over the hillside, but that doesn't mean that the people with those lots experience the same issues that we experienced with the placement of our well and septic due to the peculiarity of the underground stream on our lot as well as the pie shape of our lot. It's these physical characteristics on our lot, unlike other lots, that required us to put the house where it is. If an applicant doesn't meet this standard just because there's other underground streams and pie-shaped lots on the hillside, no one would ever be able to obtain a variance, and obviously that's not the purpose of the ordinance. I'm a lawyer, which I hope won't be held against me in this forum. I know there's at least one other lawyer here based on the comment about the ADA. But it did, the fact that I am a lawyer made me read the Thibodeau case, which is also relied on in this section of the Planning Department's analysis. And all that case says is that a variance must arise from the physical conditions of the land. That's exactly our situation. It doesn't say anything about the fact that the particular physical characteristic in question must be totally unique to that particular piece of land. It's sort of like the gentleman who talked about earthquakes earlier tonight. It's the same sort of analysis. Additionally, Mr. Thibodeau admitted at a hearing very much like this one that his request was not related to the physical circumstances of his lot. Instead, he sought the variance to make more profit from his grocery store by increasing the number of parking spaces available to his customers. Obviously, in contrast, we seek a variance because of the physical conditions of our lot. Additionally, obviously, all we're seeking is to enjoy our home and our view. We're not seeking to make any more money from our lot. With regard to the second standard, the Planning Department says that the standard is partially met because of the large number of very large porches in our neighborhood. We believe that it's substantially met because our porch is smaller. And I'd again like to direct you to those photos that are in your file. If you look at page 16 and 17 of your packet, you'll see how large our neighbor's porch is. And that's the neighbor that, Mr. Chairman, you just asked about. He approves of our variance request. If you compare that to our porch, you'll see the difference. And I'd just also like to state, and I won't go into this unless you have any questions, but the porch that's shown on page 15, you can't see the whole porch. It's much bigger than what the picture shows there. So if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. The Planning Department suggests that a smaller deck would be acceptable, and I quote from their report, which I believe is on page 6, a smaller deck, even if it does not meet the yard setbacks, could be built to allow a reasonably sized deck. Again, we believe that our proposal does meet the standards, but if there's a smaller deck, again, we're not here just to get 1 foot. We wouldn't have gone through this process for 1 foot. We don't need a variance for that. But if that is a subject people want to talk about, we're willing to talk about that. But again, we really do think that what we're asking for does meet the requirements. The hardship is not self-imposed. Now I'm on standard 3. This is a standard that they claim we could have done something about. Again, with respect to the comment in A and the one at the end of the section, I think I've already addressed my remarks to why we disagree with those comments. With respect to the Planning Department's comment in subsection B that, quote, it might have been possible to make adjustments of a few feet to the placement of the house and the porch at the time it was built, I would respectfully suggest that this is pure speculation on the part of the Planning Department about something that occurred over 16 years ago. There's no evidence in the record before you to support this speculation, and I do not believe that the board should consider speculation when it makes its decisions. And here's the facts. Here's what really happened. When we built our house, of course we were aware of the setbacks because we were trying to build a house that conformed to all the requirements that the city imposes. But again, because of that underground stream, which dictated, where things were going to be placed on our property, and because of the separation requirements for the well and the septic, we were advised by our architect and our builder that, we had to put the house where it was, and so we're right up against the setback requirement. So it wasn't us. It was indeed the condition of that property. I want to talk, if I might, just about another case that the Planning Department cites in this particular section as authority for denying us this ordinance. This is a 46-year-old case from New Jersey, and the Planning Department claims that it supports the statement that courts across the country agree that a self-imposed hardship unrelated to the physical conditions is not sufficient grounds for a variance. Again, I've explained that our situation was not self-imposed and that it's directly related to the physical condition of our lot. Additionally, the case does not say what the Planning Department says it says. It doesn't say anything about the conclusion of courts across the country. This is what the case actually says. It says, quote, hardship created by the owner, which is unrelated to the physical characteristics of the land, is not contemplated by subsection C of the New Jersey ordinance, and accordingly is not sufficient grounds for the granting of a variance in this case. Thus, the court says that it's a single, isolated situation that was faced there. It's not a general rule. And the hardship has to be unrelated to the physical characteristics of the land, as I've already said. It's completely different from our situation. What happened in that case is that some people went ahead and built a fallout shelter that violated the side yard setback without obtaining a building permit or a variance. Their next-door neighbor objected. It was determined that, indeed, the fallout shelter did violate the setback. And they had 2 acres in which to build one without any physical land restrictions on building it. In contrast, as I've said, physical characteristics do impact where we can place our porch, and we are seeking a variance in advance of expanding the porch. We're not coming here after the fact and begging you to bless something that goes into the side setback. With all due respect, I do not believe that Alaska courts, well, they're clearly not bound to follow the decision, and I don't think there's really anything in it that suggests that they would, given how different it is from our situation. And I think it's also important to emphasize that unlike the people who built the fallout shelter in New Jersey, our neighbors support what we're doing. The only comment that Mr. Barrett mentioned that he said was just sort of slightly negative actually comes from somebody who doesn't even live in our neighborhood. They live 3.2 miles away. My husband drove there this weekend to determine that. Compare that to the position of our neighbor who you asked about. He is in support of it. He wrote us a letter. The neighbor on the other side wrote us a letter. But Mr. Morris is the one who can see the porch every day. He is the only one who's visually impacted by this, and he has no problem with it. My husband did contact the Rabbit Creek Community Council president, and they also indicated that they had no problem with it. Obviously, they didn't take any kind of formal action. With respect to the last condition, the minimum variance, again, the only reason that the Planning Department asserts for saying that we don't meet this requirement is the size of the deck. We believe that what we're asking for is similar to other decks in our neighborhood, and with the same lot size, et cetera, that we have. A 1-foot expansion doesn't require a variance, and that's not what we're here for. So we hope that you'll consider our comments. We believe that all the standards are met. We think the facts support the granting of our request, and we certainly don't think that the law, as quoted to you, supports denying it. Our lot is exceptional. Our hardship is not self-imposed, and building a larger porch would allow us the same enjoyment of our lot as our neighbors. And thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you, Ms. Cutler. Are there any questions of the applicant by the board?
I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Denny.
Is there a way that you could alter the plan of your proposed deck to meet the setback requirement?
If you mean without encroaching at all into the setback, we are not interested in doing that. We would prefer to try to get a variance. The problem is that the front part of the deck that actually looks out over the inlet, that's where to increase the size of the deck. Unfortunately, that's exactly where you run up against the setback requirement.
It would actually look like an inverted piece of pizza.
Could you speak into the microphone?
The sharp end would be up towards the front.
Right.
It'd be a very odd-looking deck.
Are there any other questions? I guess just my follow-up question is, you had mentioned I want to paraphrase, open to suggestions. This isn't a suggestion, more a comment. How did you decide on a 15-foot wide expansion of your deck? How did that come out excuse me for being tongue-tied, did that come out based on the support members for the deck, or?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
We had a builder come out.
Can you speak into the microphone, please? We record this. That's okay.
We had a builder come out, and he maintained that the existing support members that we had would accept an expansion up to an additional 15 feet.
Okay.
So that's how we came to that conclusion of an additional 15 feet.
Okay.
I'm sorry, sir. Could I just add one more comment? Sure. We did also think about, obviously we knew we would have to get a variance, so we did think about other decks in the neighborhood. I mean, I guess we don't have, specific dimensions here to tell you about, but we did talk to our neighbors. Nobody had any disagreement with it, and it does seem as if there are other, larger decks of comparable size in the neighborhood.
Okay. And where exactly on this figure is the bomb shelter going? Sorry.
That's our next application.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Ron.
Thank you, through the chair. In your written response to the standards, you mentioned that you have extensive drainage system around your house. Have you made any consideration as to what impact, if any, the enlarged deck might have on site drainage?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Regarding the fact that you state you have an extensive drainage system around your house, correct, have you made any consideration about the impact, if any, that the larger deck might have on site drainage?
The larger deck will have no impact. The drainage system, we have a 140-foot long, 14 feet deep impervious barrier that's meant to protect our sewer system, and that sweeps around the sewer mound, ties into a French drainage system around the house, both sides of the house, and they nestle up, the French drainage systems nestle up against the poured concrete foundation of the house. So the deck will be many feet, past that drainage system. So it doesn't impact it at all.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of the applicant? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're at our public. You may not want to walk far in case you have some rebuttal. I don't know if there will be any. Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? Seeing none, public hearing is closed. Mr. Barrett, do you have any rebuttal comments?
No, thank you. I'm good.
Okay. I don't know if there is any rebuttal you have, but won't need to offer you the opportunity.
Not sure there's much to rebut, but I would say I know we're not here with, poor Mrs. Donatelli's problem or the problem of the Grosses, but we still think that we're entitled to the variance for the reasons stated, given the particular neighborhood that, we live in and the conditions that other folks have been able to have the larger deck. And again, thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you. With that, the matter rests with the board. Could I have a positive motion, please? Mr. Vague.
Mr. Chairman, in the case of 2010-025, I move to grant a variance from AMC 21.40.080, which requires a 25-foot side yard setback to allow a proposed deck addition to have a setback of 11.4 feet at the maximum point of encroachment, an encroachment of 13.6 feet or 54%, subject to conditions 1 and 2, as noted on page 9 of the staff packet.
Thank you, Mr. Vague. Mr. Fink, you've indicated you second that motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Vague, would you speak to your motion, please?
Yeah, I have some trouble with this one, as Mr. Ron did with an earlier one. And I do agree that with regard to standard number 1, there are some potentially exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances, the presence of the underground stream being one, which drove the placement of the house on the lot. And so I believe that I could agree that that standard is at least partially met. Standard 2, strict application of this code would create an exceptional or undue hardship. And again, large decks are common in the area. They do have a deck. I guess I could agree that that standard would be partially met. Standard 3, I heard the applicant's arguments about they didn't believe it was self-imposed, but I struggle with this one. The fact that the house was sited in that location and designed with the size of building footprint and deck that was eventually constructed. So I'm probably in agreement with staff on that it's not met. Standard 4, I do believe, is met, that it will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property, and the supporting documentation from the neighbor, I think, attests to that. And Standard 5, I agree, is substantially met, as well as 6. Standard 7, though, I believe that there is at least a smaller variance or no variance that would be possible, and it would still allow the deck to be expanded. And so I'm open to hearing other thoughts from other commission members on these topics, but for the reasons I've outlined, I probably will not support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Vague. Mr. Fink.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will support the motion. With regard to the first standard, we had testimony about the underground stream. We know that the staff pointed out from the plat, the maps, it's a pie-shaped lot, which is somewhat unusual. the implications regarding the underground stream really dictated, according to their testimony, where the well and the septic and the house placement could occur. It didn't sound like they had options, according to their testimony. So I do believe that, primarily based on the underground stream and then secondarily on that pie-shaped lot, that number one is substantially met. As to number two, I guess I'm focusing, I don't think the physical circumstances, a strict application of the code would create an exceptional hardship. But I guess I'm looking at or undue hardship, and I think the hardship would be undue. Other houses in the area have similar decks, and while the hardship, again, I don't believe is exceptional, I think it's an undue hardship. They shouldn't have to suffer that hardship, and it is a disjunctive, it's an or, so it can be exceptional or undue, and I guess I'm looking at the undue hardship. But further, I think it would deprive the applicants of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties. Other properties have very large decks in that area on their homes. To the extent this precludes them from doing so, I think there would be some deprivation there. Number three, I believe that is substantially met in that what they're dealing with, I mean, again, it comes down to the physical, the underground stream really dictated where the house could go, where the septic system could go, where the well could go. And they're trying to enjoy the use of their house. I don't think they had options. It doesn't sound like they had any options or many options as to where they put the home and where they put these things. And that really kind of, where the house is located, its footprint dictates where a deck might go. So, I mean, I don't think that hardship was self-imposed. As to 4, I agree with staff. As to 5, I agree with staff. As to 6, I agree with staff. And as to 7, in 7, the standard being the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of the land. What is reasonable? I guess in deciding what is reasonable, I'd want to look at what other houses in the area have, what other homes in the area have. And if other properties have large decks, that seems to be a reasonable use of the land there. And the testimony was that other houses do have these significant decks, and so I believe that 7 is substantially met. So I'll be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Fink. Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't intend to support the motion. I can find certain agreements that standard 3, there are physical circumstances on this lot that are peculiar and may have certainly affected the placement of the house. However, it's worth noting that the petitioner was involved from the get-go on development of this lot, and there was a deck constructed in the conforming sense, and that was used for the last 16 years now. And that ties into standard 7 in my finding that it's not met. The existing deck is, well, despite for its potential need for replacement, was functional for those years and served its needs, and provided what a deck was supposed to. During my tenure on the board, I think that we've looked at decks in a slightly different light than we have things like Arctic entries and garages and carports. And for that reason, and the reasons I've stated, I don't intend to support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Mr. Burkhart?
Standard 7, the minimum variance to grant a reasonable use of the land, that's a very interesting argument in terms of what's reasonable. And usually I think personally I view that pretty narrowly in terms of the minimum variance. But in this particular case, I see that as a very low threshold for a couple of reasons that I'm looking at the topo aerial that you see in front of that's part of our packet, and a couple of observations. This is a lot that's at the end of a cul-de-sac. that's quite a bit a ways from Golden View, and there's some rather large properties adjacent. And so the key thing for me is really the adjacent property owner not having an objection, because I think the only people that are going to notice this is the property owner of Lot 10 and any other visitors to here. That if you look at the elevation change between this lot and Golden View and the property to the east, I guess it is, that there's something close to 50-foot drop in elevation from Golden View, and the large parcel at the rear of this lot to the east looks like it has a single house. And yeah, in terms of the minimum variance grant, the reasonable use of the land, as long as the neighbor, I think, doesn't have any objection. And the other thing I guess I noticed that the neighbor cited his house away from this common property line, and from what I see on this aerial, it looks like there's maybe cars in the garage is really the portion of the house that faces the subject property that we're talking about. So in this particular case, I think standard 7 is met, but it's met not because of I think here the minimum variance I don't think amounts to anything really substantial, because the one person in the whole world who would really care about this would be the neighbor, and the neighbor's fine, and he placed his building far enough from the lot line that it doesn't seem like it crowds the neighbor. So I think I'm leaning towards voting for the variance request. And in terms of standard number 3, I guess I'm looking at page 42. And I've always, I don't live up on the hillside. I've never lived in a house that had a well and septic, but it always amazes me that the choice of well and septic is really not an individual property owner's, that he has to look at all the other property owners in terms of what they did well and septic, and I'm not sure if it's whoever gets there first gets to mark out their territory, but you can see the well radius of the property to the north there, that meant that this property owner, when he put in his septic, he couldn't invade that 100-foot well radius, and so that pushed his septic field closer to the south end of the property. He had to pick his well radius and put his well in, and I guess you'll see that people have sort of grouped their well radiuses since they overlap one another. And I guess the final point is that in terms of enjoying a deck, generally that wants to be on the south side of your property in order to get the solar gain to be a comfortable place. So I think when I look at page 42, the septic and well that really drove the location of the house, and knowing what the petitioner testified in terms of the view corridor and the deck, and the southern orientation of the deck, and the neighbor being okay with this, I guess if the neighbor had showed up here and said, nah, I don't like it, I think that would be kind of like the end of the issue for me. But, factoring all those things together, I intend to support the variance request.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhart. I intend to support the motion as well, and Mr. Burkhart kind of hit all the high points of my comments, just from a different perspective. And I also look at side yard setbacks different than other front yard setbacks that are more everyone that drives by is affected by that. This exactly right. The two people most affected by this are the petitioner, obviously, and Lot 10. And I've asked before, and I'm not the first board member the phrase "no harm, no foul" on some of these variances, and the fact that those two property owners don't or the Lot 10 doesn't object weighs heavily on my decision, as well as, quite often we've heard the siting of the well and septic have affected the placement of a house, have impacted the placement of the house. As a design engineer, I've designed a few well and septic systems. I've taken some of those comments with a grain of salt because I think they're used to the benefit of the applicant. In this case, as Mr. Burkhart said, there's besides the well placement and the type of the septic system that they're using with the 3 beds, this is a non-standard septic system. The petitioner also indicated that the curtain drain, the amount of groundwater that they're trying to deal with. I think this is a perfect example of a site where the well and septic system dictated the location of the house on what was available. And while it's a fairly large house, by the shape of the lot, the pie shape, the end of the cul-de-sac, and the septic constraints actually limited their house placement significantly. So I'm kind of working backwards as well. But as far as I'll start at standard number 7. And again, as Mr. Burkhart said, what is reasonable? Is this a minimal? Is this the minimum variance? Well, based on pictures provided by the applicant and looking at the aerial, I propose that with respect to decks in this neighborhood, this is the minimum variance, and this is the reasonable use of the land in order, as Mr. Burkhart said, to have a deck facing south or west, which is, I think, what if we had our choice living in Alaska, we'd all choose to have. With regard to standard number 1, I find that standard is substantially met. The applicant stated they weren't going to use the slope as an argument for finding the standard to be substantially met. But I think when you combine it with the groundwater, the slope, and the shape of the lot, that standard is substantially met. Standard 2, staff states that that's partially met. Standard 3, again, it's kind of the whole dominoes. Well, if the shape of the lot and the well and septic system impose the location of the house, that affects where they can put their deck. So the house placement, and therefore the need for the variance is then impacted by the side yard setback that is imposed with respect to their house placement. So I find that standard is met as well. I concur with staff regarding standards 4, 5, and 6, and spoke to standard 7 being met. So I intend to support the motion. Are there any other comments from any board members? Mr. Vig.
I do appreciate the comments of my fellow board members, and in particular Mr. Burkhart and Mr. Kars, and drawing my attention to the plot plan or the plan for the septic system on page 42 did highlight, as I reviewed that again, the siting of the building and of the house, and so I appreciate your drawing my attention to those. Thank you.
Are there any other comments? Seeing none, please vote. That motion passes by a vote of 5 to 1. The variance is granted. I should need to state, any party aggrieved by this decision has 30 days to appeal to Superior Court. The 30-day appeal period commences to run upon the mailing of the written decision. With that, that concludes our cases this evening. Now we go into the arm wrestling section of the meeting. Actually, I get the election of officers. We have the chair, vice chair, and parliamentarian are open for election. In the past, my experience, and Mr. Burkhart, you can weigh in differently, but the natural progression has been for the chair to serve for some time, but eventually step aside, and the vice chair move up, and then parliamentarian would move up to vice chair, and so on. We had the odd situation this year with Mr. Van Flein was the vice chair, and in I guess 3 months, 4 months, 6 months ago, he left the board. So Mr. Burkhart stepped up from parliamentarian to vice chair. Mr. Burkhart is possibly a short timer with us, he's indicated. So I know there's board members of various, we all have various lengths of being on this board, but there's some short people that have been on a relatively short amount of time. So cutting to the chase, I guess I think it's healthy to have a number of members being able to chair a meeting, and it's not something that I've put dibs on for any length of time. But with the makeup of the board right now, I'd be comfortable with continuing as chair, as long as it was understood as a 1-year maximum term and not a chair for life position. Unless there's someone that would like to do it in my place, and I'd be more than happy for that as well. Is Mr. Fink moving to make his pitch?
No. No, I'm not interested at all, and I haven't been here. No. And I think that's a great idea. I'm just wondering whether we should wait until we have the full board. I'm not supporting what you suggested, but
I would say yes, except when are we ever going to have a full board? It's a 1-year term. And the reason I say that, if we wait for a full board, then that makes my 1 year last longer.
De facto chair, right?
Last longer.
I'm comfortable doing whatever the board wants. It just we've got 2 members that have been appointed, right?
Well, Ms. Souza's on. She's indicated she's still on the board. She's just on maternity. I don't know if maternity leave from the board. Did we ever grant her leave from the board? And then, Ms. Croft is out. And I think we've got another board member sometime that's going to show up to make us 9. Yes, no? Mr. Barrett?
Mr. Chairman, I don't recall seeing a resume, actually, now that you mention it.
Well, wouldn't we need to also appoint the vice then and parliamentary?
Yeah.
That's why I guess we could. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I know Ms. Croft's been on the board for a while.
My question was, my thoughts were to look to the right, and then we can decide. Mr. Vig and Mr. Ron. Mr. Ron's going to try and pull that. I might not be here much longer either, but I'm not going to let that one.
No. That wasn't my question. It was more the cyclical nature of the 3-year terms and how that fits with the election to these positions. Make a brief comment in support of the chairman's kind offer. It wasn't until tonight that I realized that the chair actually sits in an enviable position of not having to divert his eyes or look at his staff packet while the rest of us scramble to make a motion.
That's exactly right.
Not to urge anyone to compete against the current chair in his re-election bid, but for future notice.
No, and that is actually, I think it was a sales pitch that someone suckered me into becoming vice chair with that, and it's a very good point. As the chair, you don't make the findings of fact. You just get to give everybody the stink eye until they do. But
no, in regards to your comment to looking to the right, I'm open to supporting the board in whatever seat necessary or way necessary that my fellow board members see fit. That's not an election campaign statement.
I guess I would mirror the chair's comments that I've been on the board for a good long time, and when I first came on the board, I think there were 2 or 3 people on the board that had been in the chair's position, and I took my a turn at vice chair and a turn or 2 at chair, and I think it gives you a real good perspective in terms of I think I've read in some planning documents that boards across the country that in sometimes that the chair isn't a voting position because that there's at least the perception if you're running the meeting that you could influence the decision. And I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules that we've made that a chair couldn't make a motion, but I think the practice that we have of the other board members doing findings of fact and making the motion, I think is exactly on point there in terms of one person not monopolizing and guiding the meeting. And so I echo Dean's comments in terms, I think that it's a stronger board if more people can do that. So I'd encourage everybody, to consider that I think it's good that, that Dean is willing to serve as chair here for another year. And I think that's a good thing to give people, the chance to think about that a little bit more and to step into that role. And I also like Mr. Ron, coming to bat in terms of findings of fact and the motion. I think we're definitely a stronger board if everybody participates in that process also. And the only way you're going to get more comfortable with making those motions is jumping in and doing it. I know you're newly on the board, and I think it took me something like 4 or 5 months to get up the courage to do, that for the first time. But yeah, that we're 9 equal members here, and I think taking your spot at findings of fact and board positions, I think, is a good thing.
I don't know if I can make a motion or not. How with that?
No.
Okay, I'm not going to make a motion, but maybe someone wants to think about making motion for officers. Then maybe Ron as vice chair and Vig as parliamentarian. Just thinking out loud here. I don't know.
Well, why don't we do it one at a time? I nominate Mr. Carrs as chair.
Second.
So been moved and seconded.
Ask for unanimous consent.
Yeah. Boy, I think we got a parliamentarian on my left. We have unanimous consent.
It doesn't go up on here.
Okay. So what do we need to do?
If there's no objection.
Is there any objection?
No.
Seeing none, I'd entertain nominations for vice chair.
I'll nominate Mr. Ron.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any objection to Mr. Ron as vice chair? We're all in favor? No.
Mr. Burkhart, can you leave some cliff notes before your departure?
Yeah.
Actually, that there is kind of like a one-page sheet in terms of the order of business that's been handed down year over year in terms of the notice or the note about any party aggrieved by the decision and everything like that. And so that's very helpful. As vice chair, just sort of, if you are elected to that position, I think that just sort of paying a little bit more attention to what the chair does, and there were little things that I didn't notice that I didn't get appreciation for until I sat in that chair, of things that you had to pay attention to in terms of the order of business and the chair ends up being a little bit more dicey on appeals because the different people can question one another in terms of, instead of just staff and the board, actually people testifying that, and so sometimes that can get, kind of hot and dicey, and we don't have too many appeals these days, but...
Yeah, I don't even know if I've chaired an appeal, but... And one of the nice things with our new system is we're working towards actually getting our cheat sheet will be available for anybody sitting in this position eventually, but we're working towards it. And yeah, I think the deal is, how did it work? I told Mr. Earnhardt, who was the chair before I was, that he could never take a vacation, and I lasted for 3 months, and then he went on to P&Z. So my word's only as good as I got a 3-month guarantee. And so yeah, I believe with that, Mr. Ron would be the vice chair, and parliamentarian would be our next officer.
I didn't hear a vote there.
I don't know that there was any objection to Mr. Ron.
Okay, that's what I was hoping for.
I think we had unanimous consent on that as well.
I think the only person that would be objecting would be Mr. Ron.
Thought about it.
That's right.
Mr. Chairman, can I
Yes, Mr. Fink.
move Mr. Vig as parliamentarian?
It's been moved. Could we have a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Care to make a speech, Mr. Vig?
Not really.
All right, that's good enough.
Want a cheat sheet for parliamentarian?
I think it's called Robert's Rules, isn't it?
No,
yeah, Mr. Roberts.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll, yeah.
I'll just sit next to Joe.
Yes, I think that's a key part of the whole thing.
And usually if there is any problem that parliamentarian asks staff, usually can set things straight.
Yeah. Been moved and seconded, and I believe I need to ask for unanimous consent, or do we have unanimous consent? Indicated that yes, we do. So with that, we have our election of officers for 1 more year. And I guess we've got a 2-week break now until we're back to our normal schedule. What does April look like?
Mr. Chairman, I believe...
Well, we know we have one postponement.
From tonight's
tonight.
Including tonight's postponement, it's a total of 4.
I'm sorry?
Including tonight's postponement, there'll be a total of 4 cases on the 8th.
Okay.
So, Dean, were you planning on being sick or gone?
Well, I'm going to tell him the day before, but no, I should be here next week. Are there any other board member comments? Seeing none, meeting's adjourned. Thanks, everybody.